morning, guys, and welcome to our first at-home class for film class. We're going to be talking today about James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause from 1955. Hopefully you've been able to get a hold of this film. I did leave some resources on Edsby for you to help you find them. Once again, if you incur any expenses as you try to find these films, hang on to your receipts. Kings will reimburse you for any money spent accessing any of these materials. So let's get started with James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. So as I said, Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, starring James Dean, Natalie Wood, and Sal Mineo. James Dean is Jim Stark, Natalie Wood is Judy, and Sal Mineo plays a character by the name of Plato. Plato, not Play-Doh, the stuff that you played with as a little kid to make little snakes out of. So a little bit about James Dean first of all. James Dean is one of the most popular and influential film stars in Hollywood history. You have seen him before, even if you've never seen one of his films. There are only 3 of them, actually. If you've ever watched an episode of Futurama, you've seen James Dean, because Fry, the main character in Futurama, is modeled after James Dean's character in this particular film. As I said, he only made 3 films, Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden, both in 1955, and then Giant in 1956. And the reason he made 3 films, and only 3 films, is that he died in 1955 at the age of 27. So all of these films he had shot already and were ready to be released, and then he died in a car accident. He had a Porsche Spyder, and ironically, right before he died, he had finished a public service announcement for speeding as part of his court sentence for being caught speeding. He really liked fast cars, and he actually had a very famous motto. It was "Live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse." Had he known that would actually happen to him, I wonder if he would have been so quick to say something like that. In the time since then, again, he has become one of the most iconic actors in cinema history. Natalie Wood, who plays Judy, she was a child actress, and that actually got in the way of her getting this role because the producers didn't think she really had the acting chops to pull this off. They saw her as a child actor who didn't actually want to be a child actor. Her domineering mother forced her into show business at the age of, at the age of about 3 or 4. And her first film was Tomorrow is Forever at age 8. She was in West Side Story and a few other, significant Hollywood films, but she wasn't really taken as a serious actor. Interestingly, at 17, she was the only actor in the film Rebel Without a Cause, about a group of teenagers who was actually a teenager. James Dean was 26 years old, and or 27, maybe something like that. And Sal Mineo was like 24. So she was the only, and that happens all the time, but she was the only one who was actually a teenager. After this film, it lent a lot of credibility to her, and it was a real boost to her career, and that career did go on for a couple of more decades. However, her career was cut tragically short in 1981, actually, when she was in a boat, not really a boating accident. She fell overboard and drowned, and at the age of 43. Interestingly, at the time, her husband, Robert Wagner, was aboard, and so was Christopher Walken, whose name you might recognize. He's still an active actor, Christopher Walken. And interestingly, her death is still under investigation even now in 2020, because it was ruled a drowning and then it was ruled suspicious, and they are still investigating. So her husband, her then husband, is still brought in for questioning to this day. And kind of the Hollywood rumor is that she actually was murdered, but we don't know. And Sal Mineo, he was great. He was once considered one of Hollywood's most promising young actors. This guy had chops. This guy could really do what he set out to do as far as making movies is concerned. He made a lot of movies. He was very sought after. He had at least one supporting actor nominee for this film, Rebel Without a Cause, and another one in the early 1970s. He again would star with James Dean the next year in Giant. Well, they had made the film earlier, but it was released the following year. So he and James Dean knew each other and were very good friends, actually. And he died at age 37 when he was stabbed to death in front of his home in a failed robbery attempt. So some very tragic outcomes for these actors. Let's talk about the historical context, guys. What was going on in the 1950s? Why was this film important? So 1950s, of course, is post-World War II. And after the war, the economy was doing really well. And there was a sharp rise in the US economy. And this was the first time that they had really seen any kind of significant financial stability in almost 30 years. Remember, we've just gone through the Great Depression, we've gone through the Second World War. The 20s were doing pretty good, but only if you were very, very wealthy. For the most part, you know, people were really working hard just to get by. But this saw a return to those times, a return to the 1920s kind of consumer lifestyle where, you know, people are buying things and acquiring things and going out and having a good time and taking advantage of the good times that they were in the middle of. There was a baby boom, of course, in the mid-1940s as GIs came back from the war, and on the GI Bill they went to college, right? So education is accessible to more people at this point, and they could afford to settle. They could move out of the cities, they could move out of the urban sort of center and start to develop what would become suburban America. And things were really, really good. Again, not just in America, but North America in general. This led to the emerging of the middle class. People had more leisure time, right? Because they didn't have to work from sun up till sundown. And this meant too that the economy was good. So, you know, money was good in people's jobs, and there was more disposable income. There were more opportunities to spend freely, as opposed to have to nickel and dime every cent so that you made sure that all of your needs were taken care of. And this was happening for the very first time. So the United States was becoming a strong consumer-based culture. And of course, it continues to be to this day, as do we here in Canada. It was also a time of domestic bliss. If you remember, in World War II, when all the men went off to war, the women had to go out of the home for the first time ever and step into the roles that were traditionally held by men, jobs in factories and things like that. And they had to be lured back to the home, to the household, because they liked their freedom. And so this is the age when automatic dishwashers and washing machines that you don't have to operate by hand and portable lightweight vacuum cleaners and all of these kind of domestic tools are made available for the very first time, and that was to draw women back into their domestic roles. By and large, they went, because again, for the last 15, almost 20 years, things had been so difficult that they just wanted to go back to the normal life that they were used to, a consistent way of life and a much more simpler way of life after a decade or two of extreme hardship. So most of these social and internal conflicts like war and gender roles and even racial tensions, things that were very, very much at the forefront of culture and society in the 20s and in the 30s, were kind of just like overlooked or neglected on a larger scale. I mean, now things like racism and things like that certainly still existed, but they weren't really dealt with as a social issue. It was a real effort to sort of strive for a simple mainstream. And so now when we look back on this time, we sort of stereotypically see a very simple time. It wasn't real complex. We sort of long for the simple days of the 1950s. And here's a typical American family. And I say typical, quote unquote, because this is sort of what we picture when we think of the typical American 50s family. But it wasn't real simple. There were all kinds of other things going on at the time that was actually made this time a little bit scary, because we also saw the rapid rise of external conflict between the United States and Russia. And this, of course, led to the Cold War. And I know from history that you guys are aware of what the Cold War was, right? This rising tension between these two major global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So these stresses would include things like the arms race, as these two most powerful countries in the world were busy trying to make sure that the other one had fewer atomic and nuclear missiles and things like that than the other one, right? And this led to something called the atomic age. So there was some real fear about potential reality of atomic bomb. And then there was the space race, this effort to dominate space. Who's going to get there first? The Russians got into space first. Americans put a man on the moon first. You can see that this is a competition. And we have McCarthyism, or anti-communism, and this was an effort to sort of shake the bushes and get communists, supposed communists, previous communists, anybody who had any ties to the Communist Party. They were kind of trying to bring those guys to light. And in Hollywood, this was a real big deal. Anybody, even remotely involved in communism at any point, was sort of brought to the mat. And then you were asked to identify others. And if you didn't, you were blacklisted. Or if you were caught, you were blacklisted, having been a communist. And blacklisted meant literally your career was over. And there were a lot of filmmakers, there were a lot of actors and executives and all kinds of people in Hollywood especially who simply just would not speak up, or totally spoke up. They got reprieve, but it ruined a lot of lives and it ruined a lot of careers as well. And of course, the Korean War. After World War II, the government promised that we will never, ever, ever engage in another conflict such as this. And then within a decade, they're at war in Korea. Another decade, they'd be at war in Vietnam, and then we would see significant change, which is what we will be talking about next, actually. At this time, there's also a cultural shift. By the mid-decade, Elvis, everybody knows who Elvis is. He ushered in the age of rock and roll, and here he's swiveling in right now. They call him the king of rock and roll. He really brought this kind of music to the forefront. This was a musical style and a sound that had never been heard in suburban middle-class America before. And it grabbed hard and fast, and it didn't let go. Still hasn't, even today in 2020. They called him Elvis the Pelvis, and he would get on stage and he would swing his hips and he would wiggle his legs around, and people were just absolutely incensed by this. They thought this guy, he might as well be fornicating right on the stage in front of all these kids. Parents, pastors, community groups, a whole bunch of other wellness organizations and things like people with social concerns, and what is this doing to our youth? It's corrupting them and turning them into juvenile delinquents. Especially with Elvis, because of what they considered the overtly sexual overtones of what it is he's actually doing on stage. Now, of course, when we watch it today by 2020 standards, it's incredibly quaint, and it's hard to even imagine that anybody would find it upsetting, but they did. And of course, because it's new, because it's this raw sound, and there is this kind of underlying sexuality to it, teenagers embraced it, and they embraced it hard. They fell in love with it, and they took it, and they made it their own, and they took the attitude that came with it as well. But this led to what a lot of people struggled with, and that was this idea that from 1955 and beyond was the age of juvenile delinquency. And this is where we start to talk about the themes and things that are going to show up in our film. So you have to remember that these are kids, just like you, your age, with more free time and more disposable income than anybody had ever seen before. And when you've got the time and you've got the money, you gotta do something with it. But it took the, sort of the producing culture of goods and services and entertainment a little while to sort of catch up to what the kids were doing, what the kids wanted. And so because they had so much money and so much disposable time and income, teenagers would become an economic force, right? Producers were forced to recognize that this youth market was an opportunity to make a lot of money. Popular pastimes, dancing. A lot of guys would buy the old 1930s and fix them up into hot rods and race cars and things. They would go hang out at drive-in theaters, and they would just kind of hang around. And this is when they started to develop this reputation of being disruptive. Because, when you get bored, you kind of start inventing things to do, and sometimes those things are, you're looking for a kick, a little bit of excitement, and maybe they don't always sit well with other people. Ironically, though, despite the reputation of teenagers being troublemakers and juvenile delinquents, crime rates themselves were relatively low. Of course, one of the ways that producers were able to reach kids was through film. In movies that spoke to the teen demographic, they got the time, they got the money, they started to become quite popular. But they were very often exploitive. They sensationalized the juvenile delinquency. And these media representations actually kind of fed the machine as far as sort of being seen as, you see, teenagers are troublemakers. Teenagers are a problem. They are a bunch of juvenile delinquents. because that's the kind of the way that they were being represented on the screen. They weren't much more than lectures. You're going to act like a delinquent, and so there are going to be consequences. So you're going to fall into a life of crime. It's going to be dangerous. There will be penalties for the things that you do. So they weren't speaking for the kids. They were really kind of lectures. They were speaking to the kids. And again, the older audiences saw this as affirmation for things that they already believed. Some popular films at this time, just to give you a sense of the kinds of films that were being made to reach and reflect this particular audience. A movie called The Blackboard Jungle, about a teacher who goes into a tough high school and has to straighten things up because the kids there are all, delinquents. The Wild One, about a biker played by Marlon Brando. Of course, Brando is rebelling against everything. Famous line is, a girl says, "What are you rebelling against?" And his reply is, "What do you got?" Everything, but nothing. Just, if it's mainstream, I'm pushing against it. High School Confidential, virtually the exact same plot line as Blackboard Jungle. The Fast Ones, the Juvenile Jungle, you get the idea. This is Brando, by the way, in The Wild One. I guess that's how bikers dressed in the 50s. So there's a poster for the Blackboard Jungle. Look at the attitude on these high school girls who look like, they should be about 4 years away from retirement. And then we've got the Juvenile Jungle, a delinquent girl, a jet-propelled gang, out for fast kicks. In High School Confidential, behind these nice school walls, a teacher's nightmare, a teenage jungle. Again, on and on and on it went. And it didn't do much to settle people's attitudes toward teenagers.
You're tearing me apart!
But Rebel Without a Cause is different. Because while most of these films were not sympathetic to the struggles that the teens were facing, you have to remember the teenagers are really teenagers, as you understand it, for the very first time. There's been no history of this gap between the older generation and the younger generation. You've been a contributing part of the family your whole life. That's what the grandparents had gone through. That's what their own parents had gone through. And this idea that you could sort of be an individual and have all of these freedoms, it didn't really exist until this time, right? So they were really trying to figure it out. And their parents didn't understand them, and they didn't understand their parents, in this gap that we're all familiar with, right? We've all had the conversation when your parents are like, "Why don't you play any music that I like? And how come you don't watch nice movies?" and all those kinds of things. I'm being a little bit playful with it, but you've had those conversations. And you're like, "You don't get it, Mom. This is 2019. And this was happening for the very first time. So very few of these films were sympathetic to the struggles that teens were facing, but Rebel Without a Cause did. It looked at the world from the perspective of the teenager. It wasn't a lecture. It was a plea for help. And this is what's happening. You've got these 3 young kids and their world is being torn apart. They face some significant tragedy as they make this transition from childhood to adulthood. And their parents don't understand what's going on. And the kids don't understand their parents. Why don't you understand what's going on? I need help. And they can't find that help anywhere. And again, instead of being a lecture on all the terrible things that you're doing, it's an opportunity to say, we're doing these things because we don't know what else to do. Help us figure it out. This is very unusual for this time. And it's one of the reasons that this film stands out, and it isn't just another one of those bad 1950s juvenile delinquent movies, of which there are many. These kids have to learn to navigate this uncharted territory, and there's almost no adult guidance. So, of course there's a struggle. How's a kid supposed to learn how to be an adult when the adults who are supposed to be the role models aren't there for them? They shame them, make them feel bad about feeling the way they feel. They shun them, just go away, your problems are not my problems. Or they completely ignore them, they're absentee altogether. So let's do a little bit of plot synopsis. I'm just going to read right from this card here. After moving to a new town, troubled teen Jim Stark, played by James Dean, is supposed to have a clean slate, although trouble always seems to find him no matter where he goes. While searching for some stability, Jim forms a bond with a disturbed classmate, Plato, played by Sal Mineo, and falls for the local girl Judy, played by Natalie Wood. However, Judy is the girlfriend of the neighborhood tough guy, Buzz, played by Corey Allen. And when Buzz violently confronts Jim and challenges him to a drag race, the new kid's real troubles begin. Jim desperately seeks guidance from his father, who cowers to a domineering wife and mother-in-law. And he spends more time trying to be Jim's pal than his father. When circumstances demand it, Jim is forced to stand tall and become the man he must become, with or without his father's help. Jim, Judy, and Plato form a family that each of them desperately desires, as they struggle to understand a world that only sees them as restless, misunderstood, juvenile delinquents. These are your restless, misunderstood juvenile delinquents, by the way. What I want to focus on as we work through this film is symbolism, very specifically. Now, there's a lot that we can talk about. We can talk about how it reflects anti-communist sentiment. We can talk about the juvenile delinquency. There's so much that we can cover. I want to cover symbolism, and I want to do that because I know it is something that you guys are actually familiar with. You've talked about symbolism for the last 4 years at least. So I know you know what it is. So let's talk about symbolism a little bit. I'm going to give you a few, and then I'm going to leave you with a few that I want you to look for and try to figure out as you watch the film. So this is a melodrama. It's a drama. Some of the emotion is a little over the top.
You're tearing me apart!
Rebel Without a Cause is a melodramatic film that strives to reach out to misunderstood youth and offer them a comforting hand. It uses a number of symbols to help the audience understand the transformations that take place in the lives of the main cast, Jim, Judy, and Plato. So in the opening scene, we find Jim, a boy of 17, laying in the gutter. He's dressed like a man but plays with a toy monkey. This can be seen as a comment on the delicate position between childhood and manhood, where this is where Jim is in his life. He's trying to figure out, how do I stop being a kid and start being a man, an adult? And the struggles that come with making this transition. Without guidance, it's a really tough thing to figure out. The color red is all over this film. Jim's jacket is red. One of Judy's outfits when we first meet her is red. Plato's socks, even the text at the beginning of the film. Color symbolism tells us that red is often a suggestion of danger, sometimes passion, and sometimes even death. The film takes place at Easter, and this is a celebration, of course, as you know, that marks the resurrection of Christ. It's the time of year, springtime, when life begins to reemerge after a long dormant winter. It's about rebirth, right? Winter is over, spring is coming, there's new life, there's rebirth. Things that were once gone are now coming back. This is true for Jim and Judy and Plato as well. It's rebirth for them because they start out as children and they go through these tremendous difficulties and they have to reemerge. They have no choice but to come back or suffer. And they do. They reemerge as different people by the end of the film. Those are just a couple right off the top of my head, to be honest with you. But there's a few that I want you to watch for, and this will end up being your assignment, actually. There are many other examples of symbolism to be aware of. However, I want you to try to figure them out. So when you're watching the film, watch for the following examples. Jackets play a huge role in this movie. They're all over the place, and for a reason, okay? People are offering jackets. Sometimes they get accepted. Sometimes they get rejected. You know, consider what's happening in these various scenes. Who's offering the jacket? Who takes it? When do they take it? Who rejects it? Why do they reject it? The jackets really symbolize some of these very important transitions within the lives of these characters, right? So pay very close attention to who these characters are, what circumstances they're in when they accept or reject the jackets, and why those things are important. Plato's socks are actually two different colors, and it's widely reported that this is actually just a production error. Sal Mineo put on two different socks. I don't know which is the true story. However, it is symbolic. It becomes symbolic. Again, sometimes author intent has little impact on what we see as having meaning, and this is one of those examples. So Plato has two different socks. One is blue and one is red. So how do the two different socks reflect Plato and Jim, right? Because they form a very tight bond very, very quickly. And finally, there's a major scene that takes place at an abandoned house, one of those old Hollywood mansions. And this plays a key role, not just as part of a film set, but also it really represents the relationship that has evolved between Jim, Judy, and Plato. Now, I'm just going to wrap it up with a few neat facts, things that you might find interesting. One of the earliest drafts of the screenplay for this film was written by Theodore Geisel, who we know as Dr. Seuss. James Dean broke his knuckle in a scene where he punches a desk when he's at the police station at the beginning of the film. If the mansion and swimming pool look familiar, they should. They belonged to Norma Desmond. It's the exact same set that was built for Sunset Boulevard. T-shirt sales plummeted in 1934 when Clark Gable didn't wear one, and it happened one night. And of course, at that time, Gable was the biggest of the big, and so men, virtually overnight, stopped wearing undershirts. And they didn't go back to wearing undershirts until James Dean wore one as a regular shirt in this film. Of course, T-shirt sales went through the roof, and they continue to be popular today. This entire film takes place over the period of about 24 hours. It starts at about 3 o'clock in the morning at the police station, and it ends at about 3 o'clock in the morning at the Griffith Observatory. When Plato's at school and he opens his locker, he's got a photo of Alan Ladd, who was an actor at the time, and this subtly hints at Plato's sexuality. Now, this is 1955. Homosexuality is not something that is spoken of in polite society, and so you sort of see it. It's quite played up, actually, as we watch the Plato character on the screen, but it's never mentioned. It's never made part of the plot, but there are subtle little hints, and this is one of them. Again, in 1955, that wasn't a subject that you would approach in a mainstream film. So your task is to watch the film. There are a few questions that you'll see when you go back and look at this as the slideshow on Edsby. There are some questions attached. They are on the last couple of slides here, so go back into Edsby and have a look. When you hand them in, please type them out and submit them as a PDF attachment via Edsby as a PDF. Don't type it into your comment box and send it that way. I want a document, and it's due Monday, March 30th. So today is Wednesday, March 25th. So you got 5 days. Beginning of the block, 8:40 a.m. is our due date. And of course, if you have questions with the film as you watch, after you watch, I can't answer the symbolism questions directly, but I can help guide you along the way. All right, so put them in the Edsby class, and then others who maybe also have the same question will see those answers, and it'll help them as well. All right, so we're gonna watch the trailer, and then it's left up to you guys.
Turn into. It's no place for kids.
A minute ago you said you didn't care if he drinks.
He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart.
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again.
Girls don't love their father. Since when? Since I got to be 16?
Stop that.
I love you, Jim. I really mean it.
No, I don't want you to go to the police. There were other people. Why should you be the only one involved?
But I am involved. We are all involved. Mom, a kid was killed tonight. This is all going too fast for me.
You better give me something. You better give me something fast.
Jimmy, you're very young. A foolish decision now could wreck your whole life. In 10 years, you'll never know this even happened.
Dad, answer her.
Stand up!
You want to kill your own father? Gary!